All right, so welcome to today's session. And we are going to be looking at chapter 2 of the main text that we are uh, examining, which is the Exploring Leadership. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, crap. Hold, hold a second. I need to include something here. Right. All right, so hopefully that will work based upon what we're looking at. All right, so I am going to bring this back up so I can keep an eye on folks as they're coming in, and we're going to be looking at our. Is everybody seeing this clearly, relative?
Yes, sir.
Right? Okay, so as I said before, we're going to be looking at chapter.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so we're looking at chapter 2 today, and in chapter 2, what we're going to be looking at is the overall concept of leadership and its evolution over time frame. So we're going to first start off with some general perception or ideas or concepts about it. So for a lot of people, for example, as the text starts off, leadership is seen as some sort of prize that people earn or achieve over time. Some of you may look at that because if you think about it, you go to work and you start working in an organization, and you look towards those people who are in supervisory positions as an opportunity to move up. So we see ourselves being sort of promoted into leadership based upon our performance throughout our time frame with the organization. So, in a lot of instances, people arrive in positions of leadership as a form of rewarding employees in an organization or um, uh, with additional responsibilities, because that's what they always say. Um, the reward of good work is more work. So, for those of you who might be familiar with that statement. Now, interestingly enough, even though we may be looking at those positions as coveted positions in the organization because it brings some sort of financial benefit or maybe even a status bump in your life, it it is not something that, as we said before, is going to be seen the same by everybody. So for some people, they look up at leadership and revere their leaders, and some people just can't stand their leaders. You might have mixed emotions with that. Now, one of the statements here by Burns, for example, is leadership is one of the most observed and yet least understood phenomenon on earth, and he's quite right about that. We have a lot of programs that have existed over time, um, where numerous organizations and individuals have tried to write up books and stuff. These are some. Here comes Miss Williams. Hi, Miss Williams. Welcome. See, you got yourself in.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon.
Hi. Did the
Well, good
reload?
morning. What am I
Good
saying?
morning. Yeah. Did the
Good
reload
morning.
help? Did the
I
did the
know
reload?
it was asking for no, it was asking for so much things, and then it's like it wanted me to sign up all over again, and I used the old link from last week, and I got in.
All right.
I don't know.
I don't know what happened, but there's been an update, and that I think is what's probably causing the issue. So hopefully other people. All right.
All
Here's.
right.
Well,
Well,
I hope it works out.
all right. Well, I got in.
All
Okay.
right. Cool. No worries. Miss Roberts, welcome. All right. So I was talking about the amount of different programs that exist. These are just a few. Any of you all familiar with any of these? Have any of you seen any of these programs, or at least, well, we have this one, the Richard Dafty Leadership Experience. That's one we're utilizing here. I have dealt with this one, the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. I actually did that program. I also did another program called the Leadership Challenge. That was out of West Virginia, University of West Virginia. I've looked at some of the stuff that Tony Robbins has done. I don't know if any of you all have ever come across those things. And there are a host of other different programs that exist, trying to teach teach people about becoming leaders and that type of stuff. The idea here just reinforces the whole concept that though leadership is something of paramount importance, it has yet to be definitively defined, explained, and dealt with by any one individual organization. You have a host of different things that come across. The problem is that leadership is seen by a lot of people differently, and therefore having any one particular approach to studying it or defining it and explaining it, the whole concept is a very difficult challenge, because leadership means so much to different people throughout our culture and throughout our lifestyles. So it's something that we have to deal with, and most programs have to treat with the fact that people view leadership differently. And leadership is seen differently in different cultures as well. When you start to move around the world, leaders are valued differently. They are, in some instances, leaders aren't challenged at all by individuals in society because of the historical and cultural belief structures that surround leadership, and the fact that leaders are supposed to be these untouchables type of things. So yeah, you have all those other different things that make it very complicated to actually study and define what leadership is all about. Now, regardless of how we view leadership culturally and so on, what we really want is we want our leaders to be able to provide solutions for the problems that we face. So, some of the problems I listed here, things like climate change, globalization, poverty, access to healthcare, education, and other public services critical to our survival. But what do you think are some of the things locally here we are hoping our leaders can help to correct? Anybody has a couple of items that they would like to put up here? Anybody? Miss Singh, what do you think? What would you like our leaders to solve? How about Miss Simon or Miss Cox?
Can see basically for poverty, whereas it comes down to the housing development situation. There are
Right.
family members.
Okay,
Same
so that's
time,
that's
there
one
are more.
additional thing. Access to housing. Good. Anything else comes to mind? Anybody else?
So does crime count?
Yes, of course it does. Isn't it one of our problems? Dealing with the issue of crime and criminal activity. Yes, that's one of the things that we are hoping our leaders can solve. Anything else comes to mind?
So does employment.
Yes, of course. We want our, especially our government leaders, we want them to help to deal with employment and unemployment, as the case might be. Olivia,
So the water issue, WASA,
right?
the
Distribution of
water issue.
water. Yeah. So that's like access, like the last thing I put here, access to public services critical to our survival. So those are some of the things that we hope our leaders can find solutions for. The problem with it is that when they don't find those solutions, we start to develop a form of distrust to the leadership around us because they've let us down. And it creates something in the country called the anti-leadership vaccine, which means that people who are probably better suited to leadership positions often find themselves less willing to take on the responsibility of leadership because of the reaction that leaders have been getting from the general society. Because they have consistently failed us in the past, anybody coming towards us and offering themselves in leadership positions are immediately looked upon as being, suspiciously. And that in itself creates a barrier to the correct persons ending up in leadership positions because the 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 simple stress of being involved in a leadership position and the resulting criticisms and disquiet that it creates for a lot of a lot of individuals plus their family, it can in fact create a situation where people no longer want to take on that headache if you think about it from that perspective. So although leadership itself can be rewarding, the problem about it is the backlash of previous leaders or previous leadership will have a negative impact on the people coming forward. So this is one of the reasons why we find ourselves having people come forward into leadership positions who are not the best suited individuals um, to take on leadership roles, and that is true across the board because in a lot of instances, men and women are less likely to take up leadership positions simply because they don't want the headache of what goes on and what takes place around them. All right, think about it in terms of yourselves. If you were offered, or if leadership opportunities came up to you within the organization, or more so, let's think about it in the concept of political environment. A lot of people would shy away from that simply because of the headache that comes with it, the public scrutiny, the public cynicism towards leaders. Everybody is thinking, okay, so what are you going to be getting out of it? And that's what we think. I mean, most of us, when we look at leadership outside there, especially in the political arena, we are always, very critical of how they behave in public office, and we expect the worst rather than expect the best, interestingly. Now, the nature of leadership itself has, over time, created a number of myths about leadership, and one of them is context. In different context, is the same type of leadership going to be practiced? So I remember coming across a situation where we were voting for a member of an organization that I was participating in. And one of the fears was that because this person was a teacher and a principal, that they would behave in a similar manner in the in this social organization that we were in. And I remember that being one of the kind of concerns because, okay, when you're treating in an educational environment with children, there's a likelihood that you might want to behave that way among adults. The reality is that that's not true. It depends upon the maturity of the individual concerned, and their ability to practice different styles of leadership based upon the context in which they were acting in. Some people, however, don't understand that, and more importantly, are unable to see the difference in behaviors. So we have that situation sometimes. I know I've had a couple of bosses in my lifetime who, because I'm in the background of teaching, they would treat with their staff the same way they treated with a class. And it's so like, you can't be talking to us like this. You're talking to adults, you're talking to people with a lot of responsibility within the organization. You can't be talking down to us like you're talking to a bunch of 6-year-olds. So that's the nature of some of the issues that come across with it. So let's go into some of the myths that have emerged about leadership. Leaders are born, not made. That's one key one that we're going to be looking at. Leadership is hierarchical, and you need to hold formal positions, have status and power to be considered a leader. You have to have charisma to be an effective leader. There's one standard way of leading that works across the board. It is impossible to be a manager and a leader simultaneously, and you only need to really have common sense to be an effective leader. So let's look and see what the truths are about those myths. Leaders are made, not born. So this first myth sits upon the concept that people are born into leadership. The reality is, and from this course that we'll look at, leadership is not something that you're born with. You may have some sort of predisposition towards it, but the reality about it is that if those predetermined or those genetic markers are not developed, and then you don't engage in training, then you're not going to be able to develop yourself as a good leader. We've seen many examples of that throughout history. Secondly, the fact that somebody may not be born with those particular characteristics doesn't mean they can't become a leader through training and through the environmental influences that shape them, as with anybody in life. All right, those things are very important for us to look at. Now, the second myth here: leadership um, leadership occurs at all levels of an organization. So they remember that that one is leadership is hierarchical and you need to hold formal positions. So that is this one here. Leadership occurs not only from the top down, but it occurs at all levels within organizations, especially modern organizations. You'd realize that in order for a leader to be more effective, they have to create leadership opportunities in the lower or subordinate ranks of an organization to be able to, one, create a succession planning system where eventually somebody who goes through the ranks and develops their leadership qualities and skills is able to rise through the organization. But more importantly, it means that leadership is something that is shared throughout the organization. Very old concepts behind leadership is that all leadership resides only with the one individual at the apex of the organization. This is not true. The reality is that better systems exist where you share that level of leadership throughout the organization. That's something that some people have to pay attention to. Marcelo, welcome. Um, so that's something that we have to pay attention to. That leadership is not only taking place in one particular part of the organization. It is something that can be shared throughout the organization through different individuals. It actually helps to make managing organizations easier if that happens. If, however, everything is centralized about around one individual or one small group of people at the very apex of this of our organization, managing the organization becomes very difficult because decision making starts to slow down. Um, you have these hoops that people have to jump through to be able to get authorization to do things, and basically an organization can find itself stalling and becoming stale in the environment. And if the environment you get stale, you can become irrelevant very quickly. So that's something that we have to talk about. Charisma. So the assumption is you must have charisma to be able to be a good, effective leader. The reality is that that is not true across the board. The reason for it is because charismatic leadership is something that um, individuals either have or don't have, but it really speaks to the impact a leader has on other people around them. So it's not something that that you have per se, but other people put on you. People tell you you're charismatic because you've created some sort of emotional response to the individuals around you. You've been able to cap, and that's something that people can create too, and that's a serious issue because it means that where people are logical in some of their decision making, if a leader is ascribed charismatic qualities, it means that suddenly we are thinking from an emotional point of view, and oftentimes that leads to very irrational decisions. And that has proven itself to be problematic throughout time frames. Um, there are lots of great leaders out there who are not described as being charismatic, but have had good impact upon them. And we've also seen the charismatic ones having negative impact on things. So, for example, if you look at this quotation from Peter Drucker, and Peter Drucker is probably one of the foremost writers of leadership and management. He says here three of the most charismatic leaders in the last century inflicted the most amount of damage to the human race. And here he was referring specifically to Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Well, we talked about two of these leaders before, Hitler and Stalin during World War II, and Stalin in the reign of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Soviet Union. But when he refers to Mao, who do you think he's referring to? Anybody familiar with this name, Mao? He's actually, the title that he carried was Chairman Mao. He was the chairman of the first Chinese Communist Party, and he created, in fact, a little known fact is that he was responsible for the death of more people than the amount that the total amount of people that died during World War II. And all of the people that were killed, or primarily the vast majority, over 6 million people, almost 7 million people were killed, is all his own people, Chinese people from in China. Through a lot of the programs and through the re-education that took place in his in during his time frame to orient the people of China towards the communist type philosophies. So if any of you all are interested, you could go and do some research on that. So this is one of the dangers of charismatic people, because people stop thinking logically because of the charisma that these individuals have. You start having these emotional responses that can lead to some seriously bad repercussions. Now, I should have probably put a picture of Chairman Mao here, but there are a couple of charismatic leaders here. We have Mahatma Gandhi. Anybody knows what Mahatma Gandhi was connected to in terms of the change that he made in society, or the world? Yes? No? Anybody?
I believe he had influence in India's independence.
Correct, yes. Talked about that. We already spoke about Adolf Hitler, and we spoke about Martin Luther King. Anybody recognizes this gentleman in shades here? Very profound guy. Nobody recognizes him. Nobody? Wow. Does the name Reverend Jim Jones mean anything to anybody?
I heard that name before.
Right. And in what context?
He was the leader of a cult, I think.
Right. And what was he infamous for?
The mass suicide in Guyana.
Correct. Yes, in Jonestown, Guyana. Yes, correct. And he was a cult leader who was ascribed great charismatic power in his time frame that he convinced. And here was the situation of the people who joined his cult or his following weren't just what's the word I want to use? They weren't uneducated individuals. That was the shocking thing about it. He was able to appeal to people who were middle class individuals who were ostracized in society um, by virtue of maybe their race or their position. Um, so, and he was able to build a following of individuals who committed themselves to trying to make a better life. He started to descend into a great deal of paranoia, and eventually, um, took his people across to Guyana, where he was offered free some land there that he was able to purchase because he was running from the persecution of the CIA or what he perceived the FBI as at that point in time. Trying to figure out who's this person. Right, Miss Rogers. Welcome. And he was able to, get people to willingly commit suicide when he thought, the things were at the end. Interestingly enough, he shot himself. He didn't drink the Kool-Aid. You ever heard that phrase? Drink, I swallowed or I drank the Kool-Aid kind of thing. Never heard that statement. But that's where it comes from, the Kool-Aid and the cyanide poisoning. Look into some films about this. There have been lots of depiction about what took place in the Jim Jones situation. Educate yourself a little bit because things like that can happen again based upon the things. All right, there's not one right way to lead. So the myth is there's one way to lead and that's the best way out told. The problem with that is that that's not true, because leadership is as much about the person who's in the leadership position as well as the context in which it's taking place. So there are two different aspects of that determine methodology in terms of the leadership style. So the person has their own group of influences, or own set of influences that help to shape them as an individual. Their individual characteristics will shape the way in which they are likely to go about leading, their styles of leadership. Similarly, the context in which they find themselves acting as a leader or acting in leadership positions will also help to determine the methodology that's going to utilize. So generally what we're going to be looking at here is, and we've talked about it when we, in the last presentation, we talked about all the different methods of leadership, from the autocratic um, to the visionary type leader. The circumstance as well as the individual shapes the methods of leadership, and there's no one right way. There are multiple ways in which leadership works across the board. All right. So, is there a distinction between management and leadership? That's the other myth that we want to talk about. So, a manager is an individual who holds a directive post in an organization. Presiding over the processes which the organization functions, allocating resources, making the best use of the people within their power. That's what a manager is. A manager is closely bound to the organization or institution, whereas a leader may not have an organization at all. They may be just generally outside there. But does it mean that the two are diametrically opposed to each other, that you cannot be a manager and a leader? The reality of this is that no, you can be both manager and leader simultaneously. It means that there are some things that are operational in nature and other things that are leadership in nature. So they can perform both managerial as well as leadership tasks. There is not a huge distinction between it. In fact, a lot of what they do overlap with each other. Effective managers have to motivate. Effective leaders have to motivate as well. They have to organize and make sure they ensure the goals. We talked about that before when we looked at the objectives of what leaders have to do. And some of them, in fact, overlap with what the managers have to do with leaders. Okay, so the reality is that you can be both simultaneously, because of that overlap process that's taking place. Leadership is teachable. Of course, this is one of the main things that we're looking at. This course wouldn't exist if we couldn't teach leadership skills across the board. That makes sense to everybody? Um, it involves a different approach to process, but it's something that we have to pay attention to across the board. All right, to make sense of everything that we're looking at. So far, so good. Everybody's. Let me just make sure I have everybody listed here. Lost somebody, I think. All right. So that's another truth. Leadership can be born. So let's start to look at some of the definitions of leadership, and with that, we're going to start examining the how leadership is kind of sort of developed over time. So the term leadership, or the word leader, first emerged in about the 1300s, and the word and the leadership that comes up from it came up or emerged in about the 1800s, and primarily it was focused on political influence. So we have to think about the context that this is taking place. So initially here we're talking about only in the English or the Western society that this has been traced. So we didn't look at any other cultures in terms of the emergence of the words themselves. Formal definitions of leadership began developing in the 1900s to the 1929. So the years are going to be important for when we start to look at certain things. So we have to think about leadership prior to the 1300s. We have, if you think about feudal societies, then you're going to realize that leaders really were going to be more of the feudal nature, where you had empires and emperors and kings and queens and that type of stuff. The 1800s, you still had that type of leadership existing, in terms of any form of democratic type of leaders that started to emerge in about the latter part of the 1800s. That's 17 in France and so on, where you had the French Revolution and that type of stuff, where the concept of democracy started to be born. After that, we find ourselves with definitions of leadership starting to emerge in study, especially in academic thing, between 1900 and 1929. Now, after the 1980s, however, we start to see a massive amount of development in terms of leadership studies. So especially it became this phenomenon that was very popular in academic studies because there was a need to understand what was taking place, and there was a need to try and define these things. So you started to see an explosion of people engaging in defining and explaining and trying to, definitively state this is what leadership is and this is what not, and so on. So you have that type of things. One of the earliest definitions, as we could see here in 1906, defined leadership as the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of controlling societal phenomena. So if we think about that definition, this is somebody who is controlling other people. So this speaks to sort of like the puppet master, because it inherently suggests that an individual is controlling what other people do. So it has a very sinister type of backdrop to it, in terms of and this is also reminiscent of the Machiavellian thing that we spoke about before, that was one of the earlier developments when it came to how to go about leading, right? Uh, so, all obviously, most of the definitions sort of defined leadership as one person controlling others and inducing them to follow his or her commands. So, we had that type of mad scientist type of approach. Contemporary definitions, however, describe leadership as a relational process based on achieving mutual goals or working towards some sort of mutual idea or concept. As we look at the development over time, we're going to see that this movement from the one individual controlling others to more of us together working towards things, working towards some sort of mutual goal. We started to realize that that was something that it took some time to get to that position. Even today, we still have a challenge with thinking of leadership as a cooperative type of activity as opposed to a competitive type of activity. Um, Guys, give me a second there. I think I need to open a door. Hold on a sec. All right, sorry about that. I'm back. All right, so we were talking about the evolution of the definitions of leadership. So we'd see that the movement from the concept of the one overall to the all of us working together kind of thinking is something that took some time to get us into that situation, or takes us a fairly lengthy amount, lengthy passage of time and thinking to get us into that thing. A lot of different fields added its help in terms of working us through it. So we be looking at the contributions from anthropology. We spoke about that, from psychology, history, sociology, the arts, philosophy, and so on. So we find that one of the better approaches to trying to understand and define leadership really comes from an integrated approach to examining human behavior and people's response to that behavior. So you'd find a number of different disciplines contribute to the way in which we're going to study leadership. All right. So today, in our contemporary time frame, we've come to the realization that there's no one correct definition of leadership, and it begs us the question: um, what decides the best definitions? All right, and that's something that we have to pay attention to because it's part of the study that we're getting into. Jalissa, welcome. Um, right, let me get back to this. Okay. In deciding which definition fits best in which context. So, because there are different methods of leading, there are different styles of leadership, then the which one best fits the circumstance. So, this is something that we have to kind of come to grips with in our studies of leadership across the board. So, there was an approach that was looked at called the metaphoric approach of defining leadership. So instead of defining something specifically as one person over another or a group of people working together to get things done, we started to use metaphors. So leadership is like this, so it's like that. Metaphor is a comparison that is not fully, that is implied rather than fully stated. So if we look at some of these, the competitive market metaphor speaks to comparing leadership to the emergence of a dominant firm in the market, in the competitive market. So this is a sort of like a business metaphor. The administrative metaphor, we have the collective bargaining that's strength by those who have the power to be able to influence others. The democratic, that's through elections and so on. The one I want to focus on is um, thinking of metaphors of leadership as an orchestra or symphony. So when we look at this situation here, from the picture, who do you see as being the leader of the orchestra? Anybody here has a musical background? No? So this guy here, what do we refer to him as in the classical orchestra situation? Anybody knows?
The
Is
conductor.
it a maestro?
The maestro or the
Maestro?
conductor, yes, yes, that's. But the conductor is the person who's sort of in charge, or the maestro who's in charge here of everybody, and he's gonna point to who has to come up. So obviously he has to be able to, pull all these individuals together to get the best out of everybody there to be able to produce a good show, correct, or a good sound. So Dupree uses that particular metaphor, but in a jazz musician, because it's a little smaller, a little more thing. He talks about a jazz band leader who must choose the music, find the right musicians, and then perform. But the effect of the performance depends upon the environment, the people actually playing in the band, the need for everybody to perform individually at their best, but collectively at their best. So there's two aspects there. And of course, the absolute dependence of the leader of the band on everybody else. So if anybody has ever performed in a band, you'd realize that the weakest member of the band kind of dictates what the band is capable of doing overall. Anybody here has ever performed in a band or played music together with other folks?
Yes.
Yes.
Alim? All right, good. Who else was the second person?
Kingston, sir.
Kingston. All right. So, Alim? What was the context that you played in a band? What type of band did you play in?
Well, I played in a rock band for a
Uh huh.
concert for my guitar class.
Right.
Um, yeah, that's happened.
Okay. So, would you say the limitations of the band was based upon the ability of the individuals plus their ability to play together? That was probably the most challenging thing that you probably get into.
Yeah, I would say so
Yeah.
because everyone started at different times. So in order for everybody to play that specific song, they had to do some people had to do extra training and some people didn't need to do any other lessons.
Right. Okay. To bring everybody up to scratch for performance.
Yeah.
All right. Kingston, what was your experience? What type of environment you were working in?
I was playing steel pans for a Christmas,
Function.
yeah,
All
as
right.
well as for graduation.
All right. And of course, skill levels are going to be important there because you have
Mm-hmm.
different voices from the different sections of the band or the different types of pan. Was it a large pan side or a small side or
It was
medium?
small. I'll say medium.
All right. How much people made up the band?
Can't quite remember the exact number,
But
but
more than 10,
yes,
20.
mm, I believe so. It's a long milestone.
Okay. Aleem, how many people were in the band that you were performing in? Five or six? Four?
Well, there was me, the guitarist, the singer, and the drummer,
Uh
and the
huh.
bassist. So four
Four
of us.
people. So a four piece, right? Okay. So that meant spending a lot of time together working, not so? Same thing with Miss Kingston. Larger the band, the more difficult it would have been to get those things done. Yes?
Yes, sir.
Right?
Yes, sir.
Was it was there a designated band leader in both instances? Or was it a cooperative approach to trying to get things done?
Well, the band leader for mine would have been the teacher.
All right. So he sort of led things. Okay, cool. Was he a
Yeah.
performer with the group or was he just outside the group leading, like a conductor?
He was he was conducting.
All right. And Miss Kingston.
The same thing. I had a conductor as well.
And he was out of the band. Now that makes it really easy, relatively, because you're able to stay from the outside and listen to what's happening overall, and therefore they could point to where the gaps are, where there's work necessary, and so on, where any one of the performers is not really coming up to scratch, and therefore would know who needs to do the extra work and as well as who doesn't, who's kind of on top of their game as opposed to those. So think about how much work is necessary be, for the individual in charge as well as for the individuals who are participating, and understand the level of cooperation that's necessary. Because if you were the band leader, Kerry, um, consider the critical nature of trying to tell which section of the band need to go and rehearse their piece more to be able to blend with the overall thing. You understand? That's something that becomes even more critical. In the case of Aleem, it would have been easier because there were only four members that made up the band. The leader could say, okay, the bassist need to go and learn his piece a little better. You're not getting your runs quite right, or the vocalist needs to, watch their key when they in this section of the song or that section of the song, or the guitarist kind of messing up here, or the drummer's doing this, dropping time in here and there. Those kind of things. Consider all of those things, and it's all based upon the willingness of the individuals who are participating in the activity to cooperate with the individual. All right, but not only that, on the day of the performance, you have to think about other things as the leader. What's the sound system going to be looking like? Where do we place the instruments? How do we get the best layout to ensure that people could see each other while they're performing and hear each other? That's even more important. Because if you can't hear each other, then you're likely to be making a lot of mistakes because there's a lack of proper monitoring to perform where because a lot of times what you're doing is you're listening for keys or you're listening for cues from different members of the band to be able to tell you what part you're in. Unless, of course, you're playing off of scores, which is a different thing. Were you guys, Aleem, playing with scores or were you all playing with by ear?
Um, by by air, I would say, because we what we did was we looked at the music videos for the song itself,
The sheet music,
and
yeah.
so each person would have separated in their mind their part because you can hear each instrument and well the song itself.
All right.
So for instance, I just listened to the guitar part and I was able to form the chords necessary. The
Right,
vocalist was able to sing along to the song itself. I was able to play along. The bassist was able to play along, and
right,
same with the drummer.
right.
Yeah.
But y'all didn't like download sheet music and stuff like that for it.
No, we didn't need to use sheet music.
Okay. Kerry, did you guys use sheet music and then eventually um, played by ear eventually?
Yes, so we start off with the sheet music
Uh-huh.
because a lot of persons couldn't get it um right away and needed to see the sheet in order
Right,
to get the correct notes.
right.
And
What
then
what
what
what kind of music were you guys playing for that? That they said it was Christmas oriented. Was it Christmas carols or was it
it was
Soca Parang? What was it?
it was a carol, a Christmas carol.
All right. Alim, was it a Christmas music or what type of song was it?
And also, we played Your Love by Outfield, which is a basic song, so which is why we didn't need sheet music and stuff.
Oh no, you could have because there's sheet music for that as well. Any music that
Yeah,
exists out
so
there, there's sheet music for it, huh? Um, yeah, but that's from the outfields, right? Big
yes,
hit, or what they call a big tune from the 80s. And curiously enough, Alim, I actually performed with them on stage once
really.
when they were, yeah,
Wow.
when they were here. They had done a performance in what's the name of that place? Pier One, and they came on stage
Yeah,
dressed as Teletubbies. I remember that. I was in a band
wow.
and we opened for them on that show. That was a
That
real.
must have been an
It
experience.
was it was a huge experience. I really enjoyed that performance. That was really cool. Played bass in a band back then. All right. So we understand the kind of concept that even though it looks like an easy, this is the four-piece here that we're talking about. It looks easy from outside. Consider the amount of work that is necessary for a leader. And so this is one of the reasons why this metaphoric definition of what leadership is probably one of the more um, interesting and all informative type because of the amount of work we can actually see going into that. So the jazz metaphor is powerful in illustrating the inclusiveness, the valuing of individuality, showing the importance of public good, because remember, we're trying to do something so everybody would enjoy it, empowering people to realize their gifts and talent. So these are the kind of things that you want a definition to be able to try and encompass when you're trying to define something as broad as leadership. And it's why one of the things we're going to be looking at would be that. This is Miss Singh again. Hi, welcome, Miss Singh. Right, she's here already. Okay. All right, so let's continue along here. All right, so we start to look at the metaphors and the metaphoric definitions to try and get a better idea. Another definition that is utilized is something called leadership as an episodic affair. So what does that mean? Episodic means that even when you're in a position of leadership, it's not something that you do all the time. It's episodic in nature, meaning that at specific times you are going to act as a leader, and at other times you're going to be doing something else. So if we think about a manager in a business or some sort of department, not everything they're going to be doing it will be leadership oriented. Some of the stuff that they're going to be doing on a regular basis will be operational in nature. Some of them will be administrative in nature, but some of this stuff will also be leadership in nature. But it doesn't mean that you're going to be acting in a leadership capacity every second of every day. That makes sense? This is one of the reasons why the metaphoric example of episodic leadership is something that we want to pay attention to. All right. So this is where we talk about, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, that kind of stuff, based upon what activity you're getting up to. You're not engaging in leadership activities every second of every day. All right. So in general, we found coming out of it is that leadership is very complex in its makeup. And it's very, as they refer to it, elusive in terms of trying to nail it down. There are different types of disciplines that can help us to understand the what happens with leadership. It's something that takes place inside here, so it's not something that's tangible. There are things that at the end of the day, you know when there's a good leader around you. You also know when there's a bad leader. In fact, the the time you feel it or see it fastest is when leadership goes wrong. We see it very quickly, and that's something it goes without saying. Good leadership, there's sort of like an even keel to how things are running in your organization or running with the activities that you're getting involved with. But the minute things start to go wrong is when we start to see leadership kind of struggling. If there is poor leadership, it shows itself very quickly. All right, something that I've found over time that tends to happen. This is especially when leaders aren't prepared for the different situations that they're likely to face. All right. Okay, so generations of leadership theory. So here we're going to start to look at the emergence of theories through time. What we're going to be looking at a lot of times is the context in which these theories have been developed, because the context oftentimes kind of dictates the thinking that's taking place. But we're also going to be looking at criticizing the theories and looking at their various shortcomings to be able to kind of get a good idea of what was taking place. So these are the theories we're going to be looking at, the various types of theories that emerged over time. So let's start looking at it moving forward here. Let's see, still have a good way to go. All right, so the first approach or theories that emerged in formal definitions and discussions is the theory of the great man approach. So this theory speaks of course, great men arising in our societies that lead us through circumstances, lead us through the world, that type of stuff. Now we have to think about in this time frame here. We're talking about the early 19th century. We had Darwinist thinking dominating the theory. Now, how many people here remember who's Darwin? And what was his theory? Anybody? Charles Darwin? Yes, Ramdan?
Evolution.
Theory of evolution and natural selection. In other words, survival of the fittest, correct? So here he is. You have to remember, during the 19th century, he was at the helm of theoretical development and that type of stuff. So consider the enlightened periods. Under this assumption, leadership is based upon hereditary properties, meaning that people are naturally endowed through genetics to have this leadership potential, this leadership capacity. So great men are really born. So here you have great men. Folklore is based upon brothers of reigning kings who are ascribed with having the ability of power and influence. It was believed that the intermarriage of the fittest would produce the aristocratic class superior to the lower classes. So again, this was all about birthright and blood rights. So what we found happening is that these individuals who emerged as leaders, that family will maintain its control and leadership positions via marriage. And one of the problems that came up with this, obviously, would be when you had eventually you kind of ran out of other leaders to marry. You start to run into issues of incestual type of relationships that tended to create problems with the genetics of the individuals and problems with the offspring, genetically speaking. Interestingly enough, though, this theory simply ignored great women because it was focused primarily on men only. Okay, so you notice a sort of misogynistic approach to things here, guys. So it's something that we're gonna have to focus on it here. So people like Joan of Arc and Catherine the Great and other female leaders were simply ignored by this theory. Um, and they were just kind of looked upon as being anomalies and not um, looked upon as being important to study. But they kind of sort of disproved the whole concept of great man theory. Any of you all ever looked at the Viking series, the first Viking series, Vikings, I should say? You could actually follow this whole great man theory, and you could see that working there in terms of the sons of Ragnar and that type of stuff rising into positions of power based upon the blood of Ragnar and that kind of stuff. A whole set of nonsense. Oh, sorry, a whole set of thinking along those lines. All right, that blood thing, Even today, some people talk about it too. Now, eventually, that theory kind of lost its steam, simply because it was difficult to find that great man law holding water across the board. So eventually, it emerged or translated into something called traits approach. So the traits theory, which was at the beginning of the 19th century, um, gave way to the fact that leaders had particular traits, and these traits determined the next generation of leaders. So this is where the father who had particular leadership traits would pass it on to their offspring, and that bloodline will keep leadership positions. And if we think about it from the medieval time frames, that's generally how leadership sort of moved from one generation to another. It passed from father to son to the next son and so on. And we had to always think about that whole issue of the bloodline. So who they had children with. So they started to stop worrying about who they were married to, um, in terms of the woman's bloodline, but really it was the father's bloodline that determined leadership and the transition of power from one leader to the other. Does it mean that every leader that was born of this particular lineage was capable of leadership or proved to be good leaders? Not necessarily. But the whole approach, the traits, was that it was something that could be passed from one to the other. Now, this actually is theory that kind of existed straight up until the end of World War II. Um, and we're going to realize that this had a very interesting impact upon the thought process, because the thought process here is that they had a particular set of traits, such as their level of intelligence, their height, their level of self confidence. What they're not talking about here in the textbook is the fact that it came with some other traits. You had to be white, male, blonde, blue-eyed, and that actually starts to speak to a concept called eugenics, which was very dangerous because it was utilized to justify some of the really negative activities that took place in the latter part of the 1930s and into the 1940s and during World War One and World War Two, because there was this belief that certain traits made for better people, not just better leaders. And there were certain elements of humans that had to be dispensed with, and that included anybody without those particular features that they talk about. For those of you who might be familiar with the history of World War One and World War Two, you'd realize that a lot of the eugenics concepts and ideas followed through, and it wasn't just in Europe. It was also very prevalent in the United States, as well as an emerging nation at the time, um, because once there was competition for resources, there was a list of people that shouldn't be getting access. So that kind of bred a sort of racism that existed there, or a set of a group of, it identified groups of individuals who were seen as subhuman, which obviously was one of the concepts that was introduced to be able to justify slavery, for example, and to justify why certain groups of people weren't classified as people; they were classified as second, second, second-rate humans. And unfortunately, that was the thinking that prevailed during this period of time. So trait theory lasted for a long time and had a seriously damaging impact upon not only how leaders arose, but also on the the impact of policy decisions in systems around the world. Who could rise to power? Who could hold office? Um, who was eligible for leadership positions? And this is what we refer to as systemic type of assumptions put into place to prevent certain people or certain groups of individuals accessing certain types of benefits as opposed to others. So we could see this as one of the supporting pillars of institutionalized racism that exists in our society today. And it's hard to break this down because people still believe in this concept of particular traits making some people superior to others, and other people um, should be subservient to that. So that's something that was problematic. Although the research itself into this traits theory failed to produce this definitive list of characteristics that somebody must have in order to be an effective leader. So the research itself proved that this didn't work. All right. But it took a while for it to kind of catch on because, as we know, there are kind of popular thinking that comes to the fore, and that popularity carries it forward with some momentum, regardless of the negativity of it. All right. However, this then led to the approach of behavioral approaches to leadership studies. So we're going to see how that that starts to emerge. So behavioral approaches began to emerge after the 1900s. We'll get some specific dates in a little bit. And what they really were focused on was looking at the behavior of managers, especially effective managers, and trying to describe and quantify that behavior to determine, well, these are the things that people need to do in order to be effective as leaders. All right. So we had right, so here we have, this is coming out after World War II. You'd see historically the field of psychology largely influenced studies on behavior approaches to further the leadership studies in the 50s and the 60s. Now we have to remember 50s and 60s means we're just coming out of World War II. So we had the whole Holocaust, that um, situation that took place. You had a lot of thinking that sort of frowned upon that traits approach, because the eugenics that came up with it, although it's still held there, um, it's sort of like it doesn't have the credence that it can to use as the basis. So they started to look at, okay, so what are the behaviors that we're looking at that will help to explain why some people are leaders and some people are not leaders. So Ohio State, the University of the United States, and Michigan Studies produced what we call a two-dimensional behavioral model, where they looked upon two sets of behaviors: consideration and initiating structure. So basically what they would say, consideration is the degree of any sort of action that a manager performed that showed concern for other people and their welfare, whereas initiating was sort of organizational behavior, stuff that they did to make sure that the goals of the organization were being achieved. So these were the two dimensions. So in essence, what they were saying, they were independent of each other, so you could score high on both of them, or low on one and high on the other. And what they were hoping to prove was, well, whatever they were trying to prove, what they were trying to prove, what leaders make, what behaviors make for better leadership. Another model from Blake and Morton looked at two other, they called it concern for people, concern for production. Similar type of concept, guys. So their research concluded now, primarily in the 50s and 60s, this research was conducted in highly industrialized environments. So here, picture a guy in a lab coat, white lab coat, in a factory with a clipboard taking notes of actions they see taking place in the factory by the supervisors and managers. And they think about it, taking a check and writing some notes, and that kind of mad scientist kind of look. Um, or quality control people that you see depicted in various films around the time. And they're taking notes and looking at every time something happens, does it fall into this area of concern for people or concern for production? And their research concluded that effective managers showed high concern for people and production. Duh. Um, that doesn't say anything. So the Michigan studies, they developed a different model where they were looking at three different types of behaviors: task-oriented behaviors, which is really the kind of concern for production; relationship-oriented behaviors, that would be behaviors that try to develop or influence the nature of the relationship between the leader or the manager and the workforce; and participative leadership, which is a different type of action that spoke to something else. And this was supposed to be a better, measure. Again, the problems that came up was that the the behavioral approaches were too simplistic in nature to explain a complex issue of like leadership, and because they limited it to only looking at the behaviors of the leader and not looking at the context in which it was taking place, then they found that the findings from their research was rather what we say inconclusive. It didn't matter, and that was simply because they ignored the context in which they were doing these studies. So, for them to then move into more conclusive types of studies, they actually started to create something called the situational contingency approach. So now they recognize, okay, so we've been ignoring the context in which the behavior is being observed, because this is a behavioral approach to things. So now they started to work with that in mind. So in this situational context approach, you have the impact now is again during the industrialized period of the 50s and 60s. Um, Again, they're trying to look at, okay, in what context are we looking at? So we're looking at production-oriented industry or factory. Are we looking at classroom? Are we looking at government? What's happening? So those are the contingency approaches. All right. Contingency theory incorporated situational moderator variables to explain leadership effectiveness. Situational theories emphasize that leadership behavior cannot be explained in a vacuum. Elements of the situation must be included. So that was the impact of the situational thing. So the main situational theories that emerged were called the least preferred co-worker model, developed in the mid 60s. It describes how the situation moderates the relationship between leader traits and effectiveness. So again, it's still stuck on this trait theory benefit thing that they're looking at as well. And then they have the path goal theory, originated in 57 by Georgiopoulos, and it posits that if a group member receives high productivity to be an easy path to attain personal goals, then they will tend to be high producers. But if personal goals are obtainable in other ways, then they were not likely to be high producers. So, in essence, what they were talking about here with this path goal theory is that if a manager is able to link the production of or the productivity of the individuals in under their charge to their own personal um, gains in terms of what they would actually want, higher wages, more work time, that type of stuff, then they are able to connect the productivity with their personal goals. They'll see more. It'll be easier to get them to do the things that are necessary for the organization. So this actually kind of starts to impinge upon or begins to point us towards motivational thinking or motivational theories. This is where transactional leadership comes in, where if you do X, if you meet this quota, you get this bonus and that type of stuff. Those are the kind of thinking that the contingency theory started to develop during that period. Again, the problem with the theory was the lacking of appropriate research and unclear connection between the outcomes and the observations. So again, there was inconsistency in their results, and there was a problem with, it really just holding water basically across the board. So eventually, these theories lost credibility over time. Um, if any of you all ever look back on, or ever get your hands to look back, a chance to look back on textbooks written about, or during the periods where they were utilizing these theories, they were extremely mathematical in nature. In fact, they'd be always be gathering data and doing statistical research and pulling all this into some heavy mathematics. And for those of you who might have done this before, you'd find they use linear regression analysis, bivariate analysis, a whole lot of statistical stuff to try and explain if there's some sort of what we call correlation. So that's with linear relational models that actually work out correlation variables or variables called R. There's a whole set of nonsense that was developed to try and make these connections across the board. So that then led us into influence theory, because here now we started to realize that motivation becomes a pretty important element. So influence theories was actually initially started in 1924 and 47 simply because they were looking at charisma. Now, 27 and 47 are very interesting because Max Weber, or the Germans will say Weber, um, used the term charisma in the managerial context to describe a form of influence that is not traditional power or formal authority, but rather on the follower's perception of the leader, given to him or endowed upon that leader with exceptional qualities. Now, this was where they started to pay attention now to charismatic leadership issues. So this is influence theory. And the reason why Max Weber started this was because 1924 and to the beginning and to the end of it became important because this was one of the things that came with Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was an extremely charismatic leader in Germany, and his charisma is what led the Germans into World War II. For any of you all who may have done some reading or simply looked at some documentaries on the time frames leading up to World War II, you'd start to understand that after World War One, Germany was sort of like wiped out because they lost the war against basically the countries around them, and they were made to pay reparations to all of those countries. And in order to do that, the country kind of went bankrupt, and in order to do so, they printed more and more money to be able to pay these debts that they had with the rest of the world in order to answer to the damage or the destruction that took place during World War One. That of course created what is the first instance of hyperinflation that took place in Germany, which meant that people weren't getting jobs there was no money to be had. The economy was sort of falling apart around it. Consider that level of economic unrest, the level of despair that was felt by the society. Young men and women couldn't get jobs. Well, young men in particular, because this is, of course, during that male-dominated time frame. Young men couldn't get jobs. They felt, sort of like useless, and they had nothing to do, and of course that led to a lot of angst in the society that Adolf Hitler was able to capitalize upon, being a charismatic speaker, and encourage people to start to think along the lines that he had. And he found a reason why their life was the way it was, and started to influence people through his discourse with them on a regular basis. These speeches that he used to have. I don't know if any of you all have ever seen clips of him, speaking. Now it's in German, so obviously it's not necessarily something that we're going to understand, of course, unless you understand German or you read the translations for it. And you'd see him, you know, shouting at the top of it. You have to think about this in the had no big, massive PA systems, right? So they were using um, the PA systems that they had back then, of course, yelling at the top of his voice and using the hand movements and the gestures, and which eventually led to the Nazi salute, which ended up you know becoming synonymous with the Nazis type of thing. So the concept that happened here is that Weber was studying the influence that he was having and the impact that his behavior and his charisma, his perceived charisma, was having on um, the audience around them. So now you have to think about contextually what was taking place during this particular development. So here we're talking about influence theory. Now, in 1977, House then proposed this formal theory of charismatic leadership explained by some set of testable variables. So, in order to be charismatic, there were certain things, sort of like coming back to the trait theory, that helped to deal with this particular thing. So, 77, interestingly enough, 77 was around the time Jim Jones and the others started getting together. And there was a lot of instances of charismatic individuals rising to the forefront in various political fields and countries, having mixed impact on the society around them. But consider where the emergent theory started with Max Weber back in the 1929 and 1947. All right. So charisma is attributed to leaders by their followers, and this is the findings that they're coming up with. It's based on the perception of followers and the attributes of the leader. The problem with this is that in a lot of instances, because of how powerful the leaders, how much power we give to that leader, we don't question whether or not they their direction is correct or not, because they are meeting our base needs of what we would like to find out. Interestingly enough, also, the theory posits that charismatic leadership works best during crisis periods in society. So you'd notice that during times when there's where there's a lot of problems taking place, charismatic leadership tends to attract the majority of us to those individuals because they're saying the things we want to hear. They are proposing the actions we would want to see happen because we feel justified in thinking along the lines that they're talking about. It's things that can create problems because look at this characteristic here they talked about. Too much deference to individual leaders by followers creates a dangerous scenario where leaders misuse their power or deliver a vision with empty dreams. And that's the danger of charismatic leadership. Because far too often, the very very charismatic leaders have led us down some seriously negative um, parts of our history. So that's the inherent danger of charismatic leadership. One of the groups here is going to come encounter that in one of the chapters that they're going to be presenting on. All right, so coming out of the 1970s now, we have the emergence of reciprocal leadership theory. So in this 1970s reciprocal leadership theory, it focused on the relationship between leaders and followers. That is a reciprocal type of activity that's taking place. Now, what do you remember of the 1970s from a historic point of view? Let's look at the context in which this theory is coming up. What's new? What's the best thing coming out of the 60s and 70s, coming out of this period? Culturally speaking, internationally. Anybody? You all ever heard of the hippie movement, the flower power movement, the British invasion, the hippie movement? No? Anybody ever heard about those things? The free love movement? Wow. Okay, so during this period, in the 70s, there was an increase in, what's the word I want to use? Uh, Individual freedom. And a lot of people started to engage. There were a couple of things that took place. You had the emergence of the pill, which was a reproductive situation because it prevented unwanted pregnancies for the majority of its thing. And that led to a sort of sexual freedom, which met a drug culture. So in the 70s, you also have to think about Vietnam and the emergence of a lot of free flow of drugs, especially in heroines and opioids, was coming into the market. And you had what was referred to as the flower power or peace movements, because you also had the Vietnam War occurring during that period out to the 60s into the early 70s. And those movements sort of met each other and created an atmosphere of freedom, and we together will be able to work with each other to fix the problems of the world. So you had this kind of one love kind of approach to things. Flower power. People were high. Women were exhibiting their women's liberation by burning bras, using the contraceptive and engaging in a lot of free love. So there was a lot of sexual activity that was engaged with without the consequence of having pregnancies and such. So they had a lot of that kind of one love movement taking place. So obviously, in that kind of context, you had the development of reciprocal leadership theories, which focused on the relationship between leaders and followers. So you also had some Eastern cultures kind of influencing what was going on here as well, because um, you had a lot of pop artists back then, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, a lot of guys going to India and China, well, not China so much, but Japan, and meeting with these gurus and leaders who spoke about one love kind of action and us working together. So you had sort of an Eastern culture being brought into Western culture that helped to move this concept of we are all one together and we need to support each other. And even if you're a leader, that interaction is based upon helping each other achieve the best things in the world together. All right. So again, it's about emphasizing the mutual goals and motivation of both followers and leaders, elevating each other and helping each other to, rise to the occasion. So it started to promote the impact of followership and leadership. All right. So that's something here. These theories posited that leadership is not just something that a leader does to followers rather leadership is a process that meaningfully engages leaders and participants. So this starts to sound nice and hairy fairy, but consider the where it came from. Again, the problem with this theory Well, the good things about this theory is that it really focused our attention on moving away from only looking at the leader and what the leader does to also looking at what the followers do and how much their contribution would assist with getting things done. All right, so that inclusive aspect of the leadership studies kind of became to the forefront during this period here. All right, and leaders were being held to account for their decisions and their actions by the followership. That's something that also came up. For those of you who might be familiar, this also precursored the Watergate scandals in the United States, which forced one president to have to resign his position, or I think they had to, um, because he was found, doing some things that weren't agreed to. So you have a lot of things that kind of supported that. And during this time frame, you also had a lot of protest action taking place against the war against establishment. So again, a period during which there's a lot of social unrest taking place um, in societies, especially the societies in which these thinkers were, sitting. They were positing their ideas in the context of what was happening around them. So obviously those kind of things. So here you had the development of a couple of theories that um, were developed during this period: the transformational leadership theory, which we spoke about, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. These three theories kind of emerge, but they all have a very similar concept behind them. So here we had one in 1978 from McGregor. Transformation leadership is a process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. So again, one of the things that came out of that period in the 1970s is a greater concern with the ethical decisions or the ethics of the decisions made by leaders, and how much that those decisions hurt or hindered our individual progress as well as group progress. And that became a really important thing because here the concept of ethical values started to become merged into leadership decision making. So prior to this, you realize that ethical values and morality weren't connected with leadership. They were always seen as more scientific in nature and was looking at different types of behaviors. So all of the transformational leadership theories spoke to things such as leaders appeal to followers higher ideals and moral values such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, humanitarianism, not to the lesser emotions such as fear, greed, jealousy, or hatred. And it's interesting that this should come up now because you'd realize that in a lot of instances, when we make political decisions in our country, both here, the United States, and other world, it's not based upon these higher ideals of liberty and justice for all, but really on fear of things that we don't even realize. So we have a fear of the next party getting in power. Um, Greed, I want mines, my time, and kind of jealousy of other groups. So you'd realize that the reality is a lot of our leaders in our context here utilize fear mongering and inherent differences to create a power hold in our societies. And that's something that we have to pay attention to because that's not the kind of leadership that we would like to see around us. It's not the transformational leadership type of thing. So that's something that we want to talk to. So the majority of this theory really speaks to this whole thing about leader followers working together and us holding each other up to um, higher moral standards or higher ethical values. It's really something that was started to emerge coming out of the 70s because again, remember a lot of the movements in the 70s and 60s questioned the status quo of why were leaders, and not only in government but also in public sector and private sector, why were they making these decisions that only benefited them, and everybody else, could take a back seat. So those were the things that they sort of focused their attention on. So these are a couple of charismatic leaders. We've met a good bit of them, of course. The ones we haven't met before, in terms of photographs here, is Abraham Lincoln. He transformed the nation of the United States from the by freeing the slaves. That was a major transformation he was dealing with. Then we had John F. Kennedy, who moved the decision, or the focus from us, not what you can do, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for the country. That was a big transformational period for him there, and is attached to that particular momentum. And then this is Mother Teresa. Her movement is really about us turning away from materialism and looking at the people um, who are less able around us, to be able to help them. All right. So those are some. We already met, as I said, um, Martin Luther King, in terms of his transformation of the thinking of in terms of the civil rights movement. And then, of course, we had um, this gentleman here, who actually the transformation he made. This is Ted Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. He was actually able to transform the United States economy out of the Great Recession that took place in the 1920s. And he was actually able to move the country forward into more prosperous timeframes um, in his governance. Not only that, he got into he was also part of the transition um, of in World War One from sorry well, in World War Two. He was synonymous with that movement that took place there. So transformational leadership is oftentimes contrasted with transactional leadership, and that's something that you're all going to get into in one of your chapters. So, in fact, we have a debate topic on this, so I'll leave the majority of the discussion there for you all to, if you choose that topic. But in essence, it's perceived that transactional leadership tends to be very goal focused, and it's about making contracts with other people to get something done. So therefore, we are trading something that somebody else values for something that the organization values. So it's a straight transactional trade. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, tries to inspire people to make changes, even though that change may be inherently difficult for the individual to do. So that's a big difference between the two. So problems with the theories: lacks focus. All right, critics of the theory is that it's lacks clarity and specificity. So it means it's too airy fairy, much like the period that we come out of the assembly. Servant leadership theory, again, same thing. It is that leaders are the function of a leader is to serve the people, not the other way around. It's not that people serve the leader, but the leader is supposed to serve those around them and empower them to then themselves become leaders. So that's what the servant leadership theory is about. That's generally what that whole theory sits about. That people who sit in leadership positions actually have the inherent responsibility of serving those around them, those below them, or those within the organization, to become the best people they can be, and inclusively of by way of preparing those individuals to eventually replace you in the organization. So that's sort of the gist of servant leadership, seen as reciprocal across the board. Again, another criticism about this theory is that it focuses on the moral dimensions of leadership. Um, it also focuses on the never ending need for learning, so that the leaders are supposed to encourage people around them to want to learn and to accomplish more, and empower them to become better at they want to do, at the things they're supposed to do, as well as being leaders themselves. So at the end of the day, that's the nature of that theory. The followership theory sits across the same sort of mind thought or frame of reference. So they outline the different types of followers or followership. We met this before. The alienated followers, the sheep, the yes people, the survivor. If you remember that diagram we had from the Kelly model. Um, so you want to move people into effective followers, but you in order to do that, you have to move people away from being robots, being unable to engage in critical thinking, and you're encouraging people to be more independent. So again, the movement of people towards independent critical thinking and being active participants in the society around us is the whole focus of the followership type of theories. So followers are supposed to be able to manage themselves well, committed to the organization, in the sense that they will do things without being asked. Um, they build their competencies. So the leader provides opportunities for the building of competencies. They are courageous, honest, and credible. So those are the kinds, again, the moral dimensions here of the whole thing. The leaders and followers look at themselves as co-adventurers. Interesting term. And instead of referring to them as followers, you refer to them as co-adventurers. That's a very interesting term to utilize to negate the negativity of the term followership. So it's something that we could look at across the board. So again, this theory again encompasses this whole thing of we together acting for for the mutual benefit of everybody, and I am going to hold you up to become better than myself. So this is, the whole concept of preparing for your eventual replacement type of situation. And a lot of leaders have trouble with that because they don't want to see themselves as being, on the way out. Now, notice also um, the paradigm that we spoke about before, the industrial paradigm, was the models that were developed coming up to the contingency theory. All of those theories were created in the industrial paradigm. I talked about that before in the 50s and 60s, where the focus was what was happening in the factory floor, what was happening in the industry. And so that's where all the attention was. Coming into that period in the 70s, you have this transition out of the industrial paradigm and into a model where we're looking at, so look at this statement here. Leadership theory in the 20th century mirrors the industrial era in that the theories were structurally functionalist, management oriented, personalistic, and focusing only on the leader, goal achievement dominated, self interested, and individualistic in outlook, male oriented, utilitarian and materialistic and ethical perspective, and realistic, technocratic, linear, quantitative, and scientific and language and methodology. This is a perfect description of what a lot, if not all, of the theories arriving in leadership was sitting in. This was the context in which these theories were developed, coming out of the 50s and 60s, and into the latter part of the 70s as well. All of these theories then had to then transitioned into the relational leadership theory, the servant and the followership theory, because the thinking started to move away from this male oriented, utilitarian, materialistic approach to things. That shifting really helped us to develop the reciprocal leadership theories, which is where we're going to be moving in the next set of things. So um, that contextual change is really important to understand why the modern theories or contemporary theories have stopped looking at the world as that particular um, in that particular context or that particular mindset. Because if you even think of the education system, our education system is set up in that format as well, where the very shape of the layout of a classroom kind of predates or predicts that you're likely to be in an office setting, where you're going to be sitting in rows and you're going to be separated from everybody so that you will do your work and you're not let anybody else talk to you. All know the classroom situation, right? You're not allowed to talk to other people during class time and all this kind of nonsense. Those things are remnants of the industrialized system or the industry focused system that existed in terms of the context in which we're preparing people to go out to work. So in today's environment, however, we're looking for people who are able to build soft skills in terms of building relationships, communicating, being able to cooperate with each other. So the techniques that are utilized in the school can't be mirror images of what was taking place in the past, because the contextual um, applications that we're looking for are asking for different skills, creativity, um, innovation. We're looking for the soft skills of group work and group mentality, group think. All of those kind of ideas don't work well in that industrialized paradigm that we were talking about before. All right, so faced with the amount of change that is taking place with us, a theory has to be developed to be able to handle that change thing. So here you're talking about, I mean, if we think about look at this quotation here. Faced with an unprecedented economic, technological, socio-political, and moral ethical tumultuous sea of change, there is a need for new theories, new applications, and just a plain new thinking about leadership. So the environment that we're looking at now is not one that is a stable environment. So in essence, what we're looking for are theories that can deal with a world that is not the straightforward world that we are taught to expect. So and when I say taught to expect, if you think about it, and for those of us who suffer from any form of OCD, um, you're going to find that this is a reality that creates a lot of trouble. Much of what is taught in school has prepared people to live and lead lives in a neat, controllable world. The reality, of course, doesn't match that. Um, what what we find ourselves living is in a world of constant change, and that change environment leads or has led us into developing theories that have to treat with the world that is as opposed to the world that we want. There's a difference. So a world filled with chaos, but one in which chaos is viewed as something to be embraced rather than feared. So this is something that we have to start to challenge ourselves, because and most of us, we operate in this world and we exist and thrive in this world without really thinking about the world as being chaotic. But if you think about theory makes some underlying principles as the development of that theory. So it views a particular set of variables as being constant. The reality is that those constants no longer exist. All right. So obviously, in a world of absolute chaotic change, we have to have theories that are able to deal with that rapid change. So that leads us into chaos theory, which is another set of theories that exists now to try and explain leadership in that particular thing. So chaos theory is, I don't know, have you all ever come across this term before? Chaos theory. There were a couple of games actually that 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 were named after this chaos theory, books and films actually. All right, so this is what the chaos theory starts to talk about. Chaos has been defined as order without predictability. So there's a pattern to the chaotic behavior, but it's not a pattern that is easily seen from outside. It's something that we have to pay attention to and look at. So The world is changing all the time, and therefore we need to have a method or system to be able to work within that world. So a couple of things have to we have to deal with. So in dealing with worlds that we can't largely control, because I mean, just think about the pandemic. Nobody predicted that, and then look at the impact that it had, and it in itself caused a lot of change. So there are a couple of things that we have to look at. And the concept here is, first thing we have to do is sensitivity to the initial conditions, which is we have to understand um, and be sensitive to what caused the first condition. Why is that? Because think about it. We recently had some stories coming out of China about a new virus popping its head up and them having some problems with it. Sensitivity to the initial condition is that, ooh, are we coming back with another one? You know, that kind of fear factor that comes up. It The reason why we have to pay attention to what happened initially is because it's likely to tell us something about how it's going to end. And that's why the chaos theory tells us to pay attention to the initial causative factors, even if it means looking backwards, right? So here we have to go retrospectively, because initially we weren't probably paying attention to the first instance of where it took place. But halfway through the chaos, we have to kind of look back and say, okay, what started this all? And then work forward from there and kind of map what's going on. Then we have to realize the 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 importance of making connection and a concept called andness. Andness means that you're literally what they call anding with other people and other things. All right. And we have to look at another aspect here, anding, and the fact that we are also have to be thinking about. All right. So anding is a concept where you have to and right and wrong together. And we have to stop thinking about either being right or wrong, but being both right and wrong. And connecting the right with the wrong to find a solution. So I know it sounds confusing because it generally is. Something might not be right or wrong, it might be both right or and wrong. So, what we have to be looking for, rather than one solution for a problem that's facing us, we have to find a set of partial solutions to and together or to join together to be able to find an eventual solution out of a problem that we have. Now, consider, for example, our situation here with crime. We've been trying a number of different techniques to deal with it. Is it working? No, because when we choose this technique, it's not working. This technique, it's not working, and so on. Well, we have to be looking at what works in this, and what works in this, and what works in this. And then we pull together all of the things that are working and them together to try and find an overall solution of possibly correct approaches. But most of it is going to be partially correct. Some of it will not be. So we have to also start to get our thinking in that line as well. That we can't only be looking for one particular solution, all right, that are all going to be right, but we're going to be looking for all possible partial solutions, some of which may be wrong, some of which may be right. No one person or no one concept is more important than the others, because all together will probably make up a solution that we can move forward with. All right. We have always thought about the world around us in black and white. Here, what the chaos theory is telling us is that we have to stop thinking on black and white and start to think in shade of gray. Now, this is a difficult thing for people who come from scientific backgrounds. Those of us with OCD, like myself, it's either wrong or it's right. You know, this is the right place to put it, as opposed to this is the wrong place to put it. It makes for a messy world. But the reality is that the world is already messy. We just live in it. We've just created a little control in a small piece of the world that we have influence. But the larger part of the world we have no influence in. And therefore, to be able to help find solutions as leaders and followers, we have to be open to this type of thinking that there's not one answer to a problem, but a wide range of partial solutions that can help us find the overall problems or deal with the problems with that. All right. So, of course, I know you are probably saying, but this song is like madness. And possibly it's true. Um, how you react it is going to be um, interesting. Um, think about it because the chaos theory is one of the more leading theories that we have to be looking at now because our solutions can't be fixed based on what we believe and what we think. We actually have to find the solutions that best meet the context in which what we're trying to deal with. So there's a whole set of issues that come with that because for those of us who don't like to think in that manner, it's kind of weird in itself, and it's difficult to work in an environment that. For example, the chaotic world is filled with self-organizing systems. That is, collection of living things whose behaviors are constantly being shaped by the surrounding environment and by the actions of those around them. Obviously, this is a very vague theory. It's a very vague way to look at how things are working around us. But the reality is that it is probably the more accurate description of how the world kind of works around us in the real world. All right, vague as it may sound and hard to nail down, and that's the problem with chaos theory. It's real difficult to nail down an approach to treating with things. All right, and that's something that we're going to have to treat with. I would ask you to do some additional reading into chaos theory. It's not an absolute it's not an absolute requirement, but try and understand what the chaos theory is all about in more details across the board. That leads us into a recent development in leadership called the authentic leadership movement. Now, in essence, this is a very idealistic theory where it speaks to the development of leadership in the context of being authentic and starts from the basic point of view of authentic people are at the center of authentic leadership, and it involves both leaders and followers, and at the base of all positive social constructive forms of leadership, it assumes that in order for somebody to be a leader they must be authentic, and the followership must also be authentic. All right, so that's across the board for both sides. All right, so the authentic leader is somebody who is confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral, ethical, future oriented, gives priority to developing associates to be leaders. So that's the essence of what authentic leadership. And we are going to borrow a lot of the concepts coming out of authentic leadership for the relational leadership model because although as idealistic as it sounds, there's a lot of positive thinking that comes from this model that we are going to borrow for the relational leadership model that we are going to be looking at, because it really does focus our attention on ethical values, the behavior of followers, um, how leaders are supposed to prepare followers to eventually replace them in the situation or the thing. Is going to focus our attention on all that transparency, openness, trust, development of followers, guidance towards worthy objectives. So this is another. These are all characteristics from the authentic leadership model that we're going to borrow and utilize in the relational leadership model, which is the next chapter that we're going to be getting into. So all of the features of the authentic leader and the authentic followers, the authentic organizations, we are going to be borrowing a lot of that. Not only because, as I would say, the biggest criticism of authentic leadership models is that it is highly idealistic in nature and tends to be very unrealistic in terms of some of the things that they're trying to achieve or that the rules hold. All right. But the importance is that it gives us an ideal against which we can measure reality. And the gaps that exist are those places that we need to work on to, to kind of fill the gaps in. Because ideally, this is the way we'd like the world to be. But the reality is that we live just less, how far back from what that ideal circumstance is the nature of the struggle that we face as leaders across the board. All right. So again, the chaos theory. I want you to read a little more about authentic leadership theory. We have a lot of this that's going to come up in the overall theories that we're going to be looking at across the board. So we've looked at a lot of theories here, but the real important thing here that I want you to pay attention to is to get an understanding of contextually why these theories exist and how these theories were influenced by the major thought processes that existed at the time that they emerged. So I want you to make that connection. How major thinking processes like Darwinism, the that thing I was talking about with the gene things. What was that called again? Oh, I always miss that. How the free love movement, the chaos of the 70s and the 60s, the impact that that had on it, the excesses of the 80s, what impact that had on the thinking during that period, the movement away from industrialization into the more group focus or collective focus that or collectivism that has become more popular as time moves on. Those concepts we have to look at is what sort of like the backbone behind the development of some of these theories across the board. All right, more or less done looking at the theories. So I don't need you to memorize any of this stuff. That don't get yourself worried about that. What I really want you to do is to look at the process through which it evolved over time. That makes sense. So don't go stressed about it. I would say out of interest, what you could do is look at some of these things. Now, there's a little video here that we could look at. Let me have it. I have it queued up here. Let me know if you guys can hear this. Video. Let me know if you're hearing the audio, please.
An introduction to leadership theory.
Are you hearing that?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Let me maximize it and
Here is a short introduction to some of the most important leadership theories, trends, and models. These can all be instructive in understanding your own leadership style, broadening your expertise, and giving you tools to improve as a manager. Great man theory. The great man theory is one of the oldest theories in leadership. It is the idea that true leaders, or heroes, are born with the innate ability to shape history. Thomas Carlyle was a historian, and he came up with a theory based on the examples of key historical figures such as Napoleon Bonaparte. However, this premise that leaders are born not made has largely been refuted. The main importance of this theory is that it reveals how we have traditionally seen leaders. Carlyle's work also gave impetus to the study of leadership and development of further leadership theories. Control and domination, power and influence. Great man theory was linked to the idea of power and that leaders would naturally dominate others by the strength of their personality. This school of leadership theory is summed up in Moore's definition of leadership from 1927. He defined leadership as the ability to impress the will of the leader on those led and induce obedience, respect, loyalty, and cooperation. The point to note here is that there's no reference to the responsibility of a leader for their followers or to any moral code. It took the extreme abuses of power by the likes of Hitler, Mao, and Stalin in the first half of the 20th century for these ideas of leadership to be properly challenged. Leadership traits and skills. Academics also started to identify the traits of leaders to see what common characteristics made a good leader. In the early iterations of the theory, these traits were also seen as inherited and linked to the idea of the great man, the charismatic male hero who was tall and good-looking. This school of thinking evolved into identifying more positive traits such as integrity, moral courage, and humility. Importantly, there was also a shift towards characteristics that could be developed. As the emphasis moved from innate to acquired characteristics, the focus moved to identify leadership skills and behaviours that could be learned, such as communication, strategic thinking, and decision-making. Action-centered leadership. John Adair's action-centered leadership model was built on the premise that leadership skills and behaviours could be taught and adopted. The simple idea behind action-centered leadership is the need to balance the three core management priorities of task, team, and individual. A good leader must continually seek to achieve the task, build the team, and support the development of each individual. Transactional and transformational leadership theories. James McGregor Byrne took the ideas of influence and behaviour in another direction when he defined the difference between transactional and transformational leadership in 1978. Transactional leadership is management using a carrot and stick approach. This functional style relies on basic human needs such as income and job security. These elements are related to the lower end of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Transformational leadership goes beyond transactional leadership. This type of leader seeks to inspire people with a compelling vision and lead them towards self-actualization at the top of the Maslow pyramid. Bernard Bass built on the work of Burns and defined the key behaviours of the transformational leader as being a positive role model, providing encouragement, and supporting followers to fulfill their potential. Situational leadership theory. The situational leadership model, developed by Paul Hersey and Ken Blanchard, took leadership theory in another slightly different direction. Their model is about having a flexible approach. It demonstrates how a leader can adapt their management style depending upon the experience of the team and the individuals they are working with, while also considering the environment and circumstances they find themselves in. The leader chooses their approach, either delegating, supporting, coaching, or directing, depending upon the situation. Values-based leadership. Values-based leadership developed in response to various moral failings of prominent leaders. This school of leadership, related to trait theory, encompasses both servant leadership and authentic leadership models. The central idea is that the values-based leader has a strong moral compass and leads according to their personal values and the shared values of their organisation or community. This model stresses the importance of being a good leader, not just a charismatic one, and the ability to make the right or ethical decisions, not just effective or bold choices. Servant leadership theory. The idea of the servant as leader was developed by Robert Greenleaf. This model of servant leadership is primarily about motivation. The servant leader wants to serve others and society by raising up new leaders and helping people to move towards a positive vision of the future. They are not seeking power for themselves. Instead, servant leaders share power and empower others. Toxic or bad leaders. At the other end of the scale, academics also started to identify the opposite of values-based or good leaders. Marcia Lynn Wicker popularized the term toxic leader, and various models have been developed to identify such bad leadership. For example, Barbara Kellerman's study identified 7 types of bad leader. These are incompetent, rigid, intemperate, callous, corrupt, insular, or evil. Authentic leadership theory. The term authentic leadership was first popularized by leadership practitioner Bill George. He wrote a book by the same name in response to failures of senior corporate management, such as the fraudulent behavior that led to the fall of energy giant Enron. George advocated for leaders of purpose, values, and integrity, rather than those motivated by greed and power. George's academic colleagues, Bruce Avolio and William Gardner, then developed models around this concept, identifying the key behaviors or traits of an authentic leader. These included self-awareness and self-regulation, balanced processing of information, relational transparency, and a strong sense of morality. So that is a very quick introduction to some of the key leadership schools, theories, and models. Theory can be a little dry, but understanding these models is important. They help to give us language and concepts. They help us reflect on our own leadership experience and the conduct of others. They give us tools to help and to use in our own leadership practice, and they also act as signposts of ways that we can help to develop and grow other leaders. And you can start now. Take a few minutes to reflect. Which of the leadership theories are most intriguing to you? What does this model reveal about your own leadership? Which tool could you apply in the interactions that you have today?
Forgot to put my volume back on. Sorry about that. All right, quite an interesting little video that kind of encapsulated everything we looked at and some additional ideas and concepts. All right, so at this point in time, we have a little bit of time here. You guys have any questions you want to ask, clarification on whatnot? Nope. Everybody thinks they're okay with that? As I said before, there's no need to memorize any of this stuff. You're free to, just think about it, and really, as I said, reflect upon your thinking and your positioning in relation to this. All right. Okay. Anybody has any questions or concerns related to this session or anything else that comes to mind that you want to talk about or ask about? If not, we could call it Jorge, and I'll see you all next week for chapter 3, and then after that we'll start getting our presentations from the class itself. Any questions in relation to that, guys? Nope. Okay. So, all right, Jamel. Thanks. Let me stop the recording, and then we could call it Jorge for the evening.